Really give you the stage. I'm just waiting for thumbs up from the guys. Thank you so much, and please enjoy this workshop, and please do ask questions. This is a lovely opportunity to just learn about how to build a personal brand and just how to be yourself in any place. So thank you so much, and enjoy.
Thanks, Julia. So hi everyone, officially. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
You might have noticed I'm struggling with, I've got hearing aids. I have hearing loss. So I have 2 hearing aids, but I've taken one out now, and hopefully all the squeaking will be okay. But you know, if anything goes technically wrong, just kind of wave and stop me. So I'm here today because I'm an art director, and my name is Fiona Hayes. I'm an art director, and I'm going to talk, as Julia said, about working internationally and building your personal brand. And I'm going to keep looking at my notes on the iPad as we go along, I'm afraid, simply because if I don't do that, I will go off on far too many tangents, and we'll be here all weekend, basically. So what I think we'll do, what I suggest we do, is I'll tell you my story, first of all, and then I timed it today. It takes about 45 minutes or so, and then we can ask questions if you have questions, and then I think we'll kind of segue into a bit about building personal brands, I suppose. So I was thinking about what to say today, and working internationally is very straightforward, very easy, because over my career I've worked in many different places. I've worked in different countries. Sometimes I've lived there, sometimes I've traveled back and forth, and sometimes it's working remotely with a team in another location. So working internationally has evolved over the last 30 years, but that's straightforward enough. Building your personal brand is a little bit of a strange one, really, because, certainly for me when I think about it, because I'm not an influencer. I don't have a product that I sell. I don't make anything. I'm not a public speaker. And to me, it seems that when you talk about building a brand, it sounds like that, like you have a plan or you have a strategy, and you have goals, and you have certain things you want to say, certain ways you want to present yourself to certain audiences, and so on. And obviously, we all do have an idea about how we like to present ourselves to people and to the world in general. But I have no plan. I have no strategy, and I definitely have no goals. And I think I may go against the grain a bit here by saying I don't think I really believe in goals, not for individuals anyway, maybe for businesses. Makes sense for business to have goals, but not people. Because if you say your goal is you want to be CEO of a company by the time you're 30, what happens is, you spend your 20s chasing that and working really hard to get to that goal. And if you don't achieve it, you feel like you've failed. And if you do achieve it, well, what's your motivation to do next? What do you do now? And similarly, if your goal is to win awards or to be a champion or to be the best at something, again, it's kind of, you spend a lot of time pressurizing yourself to achieve that. And if you don't achieve it, you can feel like a failure. And if you do, you kind of run out of motivation again. So basically, I have no goals, and I don't do goals. However, I do have a philosophy. My philosophy is do interesting work in interesting places with interesting people. And I came up with this years and years ago. I can't remember exactly where this came from, but it is actually something that I really stick to in my life and career, really. And the thing is, when it comes to work, to the world of work, if you measure your career satisfaction by things like job titles and salaries and that sort of thing, then you're always going to be chasing those things, and you're always going to be dependent on other people's evaluation of your worth. And also the phrase love what you do, love your job, do what you love, that's the phrase, really. That kind of implies that your job should be pleasant and enjoyable, but no matter what, no matter how much you love something, Nothing is 100% pleasant and enjoyable 100% of the time. You know, you might end up working with people that you don't particularly like, or you might end up doing too many hours, you might end up getting stressed by work, and it can become very discouraging. You're thinking, I'm supposed to be doing what I love, but I hate it suddenly. Interesting, though interesting is different. Interesting work is not always the best paid. Interesting places are not always the most relaxed and enjoyable places to be, and interesting people are not always the nicest people. In fact, some of the most interesting people are total nightmares. But I've always chosen it's interesting over anything else, just because interesting opens your mind. It opens the possibilities, it opens the horizon, it makes things change and makes things happen. And life's too short to be bored, I think, really. So what I kind of, apart from talking about working internationally, I put quite a lot in here about how I've got jobs and what's taken me from here to there, because because I think it might be helpful. And you guys are much closer to the start of your careers, so maybe it'll be useful to hear some of how I got started in my career as well. So starting off, when I was growing up, I'm Irish. I grew up in Ireland, mostly in Ireland. And I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to be an illustrator, actually. And I was crazy about fantasy art and science fiction. And drawing and painting was really all I wanted to do. And I wasn't actually allowed to do art in school because the art classes clashed with, I don't know, something geography or maths or something like that. So I couldn't do art in school. And no one from my school had ever gone to art college before. And it was the 80s. It was Ireland. It was the middle of the Irish countryside in the 1980s. It was the Sisters of Mercy convent school. It was hell. And as I say, no one had ever gone to art college from my school. And when I told the careers guidance counselor teacher that I wanted to go to art college, she had absolutely no idea what that meant or where I could apply or what you should do. And because she usually suggested you should be an accountant or a nurse. So I ended up making a portfolio of just drawings that I did in my bedroom by myself, paintings that I did at the weekends by myself. And I applied to the 3 art schools that were in Ireland at that time. And I got accepted to all of them, which totally freaked out my parents, because my parents also had no idea what an artist would do or how you'd make a living as an illustrator or anything like that. But they did allow me to take up one of the positions at the National College of Art and Design in Dublin. And that was on the condition, well, the course was called Visual Communication because there was no illustration course. And they allowed me to take up the course on the provision that I did a joint honours degree with history, because they thought, well, you can always become a teacher. And in fact, they were right, but it did take 30 years for me to become a teacher. So right after I graduated, there were no jobs in Ireland. There were no jobs for anyone in Ireland. It was 1988. And, well, presumably nurses and accountants were okay, but the rest of us had to leave. So I left home and I came to London. And I didn't want to be in London. I wanted to go to New York. And the last summer that I was in art college, I had gone to New York and done some work experience. And I absolutely loved it. But actually applying for a job in New York, applying for a visa to work in New York was very, very difficult. So if you didn't have work already. Whereas in London, I came over. I think I arrived on a Monday. I made 3 phone calls on a Tuesday, set up a couple of interviews, and I had a job by Friday, because that was the 80s. It was something else. And the job was freelance, and it was at Radio Times. Does anyone, put up your hands if you've heard of Radio Times. 1 person, 2 people. That's it. So Radio Times was, I think it still exists, but Radio Times was a weekly TV and radio listings magazine. It was a magazine that told you what was on your television and on your radio. And when I was working there, it was the biggest selling weekly publication in the UK. Everyone bought it. That wasn't the reason I'd actually called them and said, could I get some freelance work? I'd called them because one of the people I met in New York had started his career at Radio Times, and he recommended it. So I thought, I'll give it a try. And he was the art director of Rolling Stone, actually. So this is me in the art department moving very fast, about 1988, no, 1989, anyway, whenever. I just started. And my desk is covered with sheets of paper and photographic film. See, this is all photographic film, and these are printouts from a laser printer or something, and sheets of paper here. And this thing here is called a type scale. It's something that you use to figure out what size the letters are and what the leading is between them. It's a piece of plastic. This thing here, if any of you know any old people who were designers at any point, ask them to tell you about cow gum. Iconic. And the reason why this picture has me and my friend Laura with our desk covered in paper and stuff was because back then, of course, we worked on paper and we worked on film, because digital cameras they only came into use in the late 1990s, and in the 80s, no one used computers for layouts or reading the news or watching movies or streaming music or anything else, because computers basically didn't really exist. I mean, they existed, but they weren't in common use. The internet was invented in 1983, but it wasn't actually available to the public till 1993. So while I'm doing this, there was no internet. And this, of course, explains why every week in the UK, millions of people bought a piece of paper to tell them what was going to be on their television that week. So Radio Times was not glamorous, but I learned a ton. And one of the things, happily, I learned after a while was how to use computers, because BBC Enterprises, who ran the magazine, they decided to set up a special projects unit. And the special projects unit was basically me as a designer and two journalists, and we were put in a room with a couple of these ugly newfangled computer things, and we were told, come up with ideas for magazine launches. And so, which we did. And the machines were very basic, and the ideas were not very exciting either, because there were things like Good Food magazine and Gardening magazine and Antiques magazine and stuff like that. But it was very useful to learn how to use computers. And I was still on a freelance contract there, so I was able to actually make some calls and get some more freelance work. And one of the places, for instance, that I went to was a newspaper, because back then, and up until, let's say 10 years ago, working on newspapers was a very good thing to do if you were a graphic designer, because the money was good. The money was better in newspapers than it was in magazines. And there are tons of newspapers, and they're all daily, so there's always tons of work. So this was the Independent, where I worked for a while. And it was a broadsheet, as you can see. Another totally different place I freelanced was Smash Hits. Has anyone heard of Smash Hits? I feel old. All right, so Smash Hits was a pop magazine, pop music magazine. And my sister and I loved this magazine growing up, absolutely loved it. It was all, pop music. And I was really excited to get the chance to work there as a grown-up. But it turned out that working on the magazine was a lot less fun than reading the magazine. And I learned an important lesson for me there. I don't say this will apply to all of you, but you know the saying, be careful about meeting your heroes because you'll be disappointed. I find that if there's a magazine that you love and you get a job on it, it's a bad idea. You're usually disappointed. Anyway, those are some of the places I freelanced. And then there was Punch. I'm going to ask you, has anyone ever heard of Punch? Oh, good, one person. Good, okay, that's good. Several people. So Punch is a legend. It was a fortnightly satirical magazine. And if you know Private Eye today, Punch was a bit like that, but we had slightly better paper and production values. And it was founded in 1891, and it was famous for cartoons. And a friend had got the job of deputy editor there, and he asked me if I would come and do some freelancing in the art department. So I did, and I think I'd been there for about a week when the art editor announced that he was leaving, and I ended up getting his job. And I think I was 25, and I'd never had a full-time job before at that point. And I'd never run a magazine before, and I had 3 designers, and we had a really tight schedule, and it was a steep learning curve, because I had to learn how to work with the advertising department, the features writers, and all the cartoonists. And it was kind of hair-raising and stressful, but it was fun. And Punch didn't use photography really, but as you can see, apart from the cartoons, we used a lot of illustration, and I used to commission tons of illustration, and that made me very happy. And and as I mentioned, so Punch was famous for its cartoons, and the person who chose which cartoons went into the magazine every week was a cartoon editor whose name was Steve Way. And Steve would come into the office once or twice a week, and I didn't know he was doing that. So I stole his desk, which wasn't a great start. And that's me up there, and that's Steve on the magazine's 150th anniversary issue. And happily, after he forgave me for stealing his desk, we started going out together, and we're still going out together, so that was a happy ending. He's at home in Shepherd's Bush now, and cooking my dinner, I hope. And sadly, not such a happy ending for Punch itself, because after the year after this, after the 150th anniversary, the parent company, Associated Newspapers, decided it wasn't making enough money, losing quite a lot of money, so they closed the magazine down, and we were all out of a job. And in fact, by a really weird coincidence, yesterday evening I was putting a few finishing touches to some oats, and I was listening to BBC Six Music, and the DJ who was on, Steve Lamacq, he always does this kind of what's in the headlines, talk about pop culture stuff. And he said, this day, 30 years ago, was when Punch closed down. So I texted him and said I was there. My moment of fame. Anyway, I went back. Punch closed. I went back to freelancing, and this time I thought I better do some different stuff. So I better get some experience of photography and magazines that aren't dailies or weeklies. So I started doing design shifts at Elle and at Cosmopolitan and at Marie Claire and at this magazine. This is Company. So Company doesn't exist anymore. It was published by the National Magazine Company, which we used to call NatMags. Nowadays, NatMags has been incorporated back into its American parent company, which is Hearst. And Company, the magazine, was aimed at young women in what they called the freedom years, which is, women who were just starting their careers, who were ambitious, but they wanted to have fun. And we ran a bit of everything. We had sex, careers, advice, fashion, beauty, bit of reportage, bit of news, bit of relationships. And the big difference for me with this job, obviously, was that it was monthly. So we had a lot longer to put together the issues. But of course, being monthly also was a lot bigger. And again, we're still talking about early 90s. So advertising for magazines was still very, very powerful. And print magazines were doing really well. And the internet still hadn't come along to shake us out of our trees. And so magazines like this, they were selling a lot, and they were quite thick, and we had a lot of advertising, a lot of pages. So you had a month to put the whole thing together, but that meant that everyone just took a month to make a decision instead of making a decision in a week. And I did discover that it's harder than I thought it would be. And there was a lot of late nights, but our office was in Soho, in the middle of Soho, so we did a lot of late night working, but also a lot of late night drinking cocktails as well. So it wasn't all bad. And then, after I'd been at Company for about a year and a half, Steve, the cartoon editor boyfriend, he saw an ad for a job one day in the Guardian media section. So back then, the Guardian newspaper had job sections where everybody looked for their jobs, every job. And Mondays were Media Monday. So that was when you looked for your jobs in advertising, publishing, TV, all that kind of stuff. So he found this ad and he showed it to me, and he said, look, how bizarre does this job sound? And the job was art director of Cosmopolitan in Russia. And who knew there was a Cosmo in Russia? And he said, you should apply for it for a laugh. I think I don't know, I think maybe we're having a bad patch, I can't quite remember. But anyway, I applied for it. I thought it would be very funny, and I applied for it. And I got the job. So, in the light of everything that's happening now, and Putin invading Ukraine, it seems really weird. This has been really, I've had quite a few talks in the last month, and it's really weird talking about working in Russia, but I've actually worked in Russia 4 times, and the most recent time was 2020, So I can't airbrush it out of my past. It's part of my career history. Anyway, this is the first time. So this was 1995, and Hearst, the American company, had launched Cosmo in Russia, I think about 2 years earlier, with a license partner called Independent Media, a Dutch company. And what you have here is on the far side, that's the American cover, middle is a Mexican cover, and this one here is the Russian cover. And what you can see from this, that they all kind of looked like clones, basically. So I designed this, but I had to use the American version as my guide. And the thing about Russian Cosmo at that point, the thing about Russia, the thing about Cosmo, was that glossy magazines were brand new still. And the company, so Independent Media in Moscow, they were having a hard time finding staff who could understand and deliver a magazine that was like a Western magazine, because people just didn't have the experience and they didn't have the reference points. You know, designers working in Moscow just hadn't worked on anything like that before. So when they found me, or when I found them, and I had my years' experience as art director company, and I'd worked at Elle, and I'd worked at British Cosmo, and they were very excited. Obviously, they thought, great, problem solved. So they were delighted. I got cold feet, however, basically as soon as I sent off my CV. And when they sent me a message asking to see my portfolio, to see some of my work, I thought, no, stupid, terrible idea, forget this. So I ignored it. And then a few days later, I think they sent me a message saying that the publisher was coming to London and she'd like to meet me for a coffee. And I thought, well, I can't really say no to that. So I had coffee with the publisher, who's Dutch, Annemarie van Gaal, very nice lady. We got on very well. And she said, why don't you come to Moscow for a weekend and just see what you think? So I did. So I went to Moscow for the first time. It was February 1995, and it was snowing, and the drive-in from the... Has anyone been to Moscow? A few people have been to Moscow, but so the drive-in from the airport, it was snowing really heavily. It was like something from Dr. Zhivago, really ugly Dr. Zhivago. You know, very scruffy and dirty, but it was very romantic nonetheless. And in 1995 in Moscow, I have to say, all the buildings smelled terrible. The light bulbs kept blowing. There were a lot of cockroaches around. And there were very few shops. And there were very few things to buy in the shops. And this was a big problem for Western magazines, because Western magazines magazines like Cosmo and Vogue and Marie Claire, they're all predicated on consumerism, buying stuff. And so if you are somewhere where there's just not much to consume, how do you keep going as a magazine? That was a big problem. I think the person who had the hardest job was the fashion director, Ellen Verbeek, because she was trying to do fashion shoots. There were no designer labels, there were no high street shops. People were buying their fashion, they're buying their clothes from markets or making their own clothes. It was just like, what do you do? Anyway, the lack of stuff to buy did not actually stop Russians from being very interested in fashion and very excited about fashion. And for one demographic, this was because modeling for fashion magazines had suddenly arisen as a way to change your life, actually, because Moscow, Russia in the early 90s, after the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Glasnost had come in, and Western petrochemical companies were rushing in, and so on. But Western model agencies were also rushing in, and many young women, particularly, and their families, were seizing the opportunity to get scouted by a model agency, because that meant you could go to Paris or London or Milan or New York and you could change your life. And there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of model competitions, modeling events, and models showing up all the time. Not enough clothes for the poor girls. But anyway, Independent Media took advantage of this to launch a magazine called Cosmopolitan Supermodel. And we ran stories about all kinds of international things. At the top there's the woman in white. That's Nadja Auermann. She was a huge supermodel in the 90s, and she came to Moscow that summer. This one down here is Natalia Samyanova, who was then a very, very young Russian girl, but she became a big Russian modeling star. And so I'd only been in Moscow for a very short time when my old boss at company whose name is Mandy Norwood. She was the editor-in-chief, and she got made editor-in-chief of British Cosmo. And she wanted me to come back to London to work with her, which frankly I was very happy to do, but I felt bad about flaking on independent media, and it was going to be difficult. So what I did was I called head office. I called New York, and I spoke to the editorial director of Cosmo Worldwide. We'd never met, she didn't know me, but she did know my name because her job is obviously to know what's going on in all the offices around the world. So she knew my name. And I explained the situation and said, Moscow, love it, brilliant, but Mandy wants me back in London, what should I do? And she said, well, the new editor-in-chief at British Cosmo is the biggest thing to happen for this brand for 10 years, so come back to London. So that was very nice. So that's what I did. And British Cosmo, so you can see from the covers over there, they're still very much on the same kind of lines as though that American one. There's a billion lines. We just put like any clear space, you put a cover line on it. But British Cosmo was the second biggest edition in the world after the American edition, and it was the biggest selling women's monthly in the UK. And the British edition had quite a lot of autonomy, so I had more of a free hand with the design on this, which is always something that designers like. And I had a big team at Cosmo, so there were 5 of us designers and 2 picture editors, and we did a ton of photo shoots. We did shoots for things like what were called emotional features. So this thing up here, see this, From Here to Eternity, the 7 biggest blocks to commitment. So this was a story about the 7 biggest blocks to relationship commitment. And what we did was I commissioned a photographer to build a set. And the set is, as you can see, tall as this room. And he built this actual set, and we did the typography on the set, and we cast a model, and his job was to shoot the model in this giant set. We were always doing things like that. It was really labor intensive, but there was still, you couldn't do it any other way. There were no computers. Well, there were computers, but it didn't really work like that. So Cosmo, so I kept going with Cosmo. I loved it. Art directing was an amazing job, very big job, but I still wanted to try to work in New York. I had not forgotten since my student days that I really wanted to go to New York. So I booked a week's holiday in New York, and I went to see the editorial director of Condé Nast, and they publish magazines like GQ and Glamour, and I showed him my portfolio, and I said I'd love to work in New York, and he said, I see you worked in Russia. Yes, but I want to work in New York. And he said, do you know we're launching Vogue in Russia? And I said, yes, I had heard that, but I want to work in New York. So guess what happened? They sent me to Russia. So I moved to Moscow for the second time on March 22nd, 1998, to launch Vogue Russia. And in the 3 years since I'd been there, quite a few things had changed already. So there were more shops, more cafes, more luxury hotels and Western labels, and the buildings were cleaner. And we felt very optimistic. So I set about finding designers and finding photographers, local photographers to work with, people I'd worked with already at Cosmo and all kinds of stuff like that. Our computers were installed, and I had a great desk on the 10th floor of a building overlooking the city center. It was really, really cool. And I have a lot of anecdotes about the launch of Russian Vogue, which I will not tell you here. As I say, time is finite. But I will say that the foundations for the new Russia, which we'd all pinned our hopes on, the foundations for the new Russia were not very stable, and there was no infrastructure to support all the economic booming that was going on. And basically, over the course of the summer 1998, things started to go badly wrong. So what I want to read you a quote from a writer named Michael Idov about the launch of Vogue, and that over there, Россия, наконец, that's the very first edition of Russian Vogue. So Michael wrote, on August 17th, 1998, with the magazine's premiere issue at the printers, Russia defaulted on its debt obligations. The ruble cratered overnight, falling to 1/3 of its dollar value. Fortunes were wiped out, banks mobbed and then shuttered. Foreign goods, to which the Russians had just grown accustomed, vanished from the shelves. The country re-entered crisis mode. Vogue's Lesh launch party underwent a hasty scale down. In fact, I think it was cancelled completely. The Moscow Komsomolets, its tabloid newspaper, predicted that Vogue's first Russian issue might become its last, and that the entire publishing house would pull out of the market. It had barely begun to crack. And I remember that morning that he's talking about, because I'd gone into the office and there was no one in the office, and I said, "Where is everyone?" And my boss said, "Do you have any money in your Russian bank account?" And I said, $1,000? And he said, "That's okay." And it turned out everyone else had gone to the banks to try and get their money out before the banks closed. Anyway, Russian Vogue managed to survive that time. And Michael Ida went on to be editor of Russian GQ. And over the years, Condé Nast was very successful in Russia. It launched many more brands: Architectural Digest, GQ Style, Glamour Tatler, and a creative studio, and all kinds of things. And I stayed there for another year and a half. And at the end of that time, I was homesick. So I went back to London, and I put out the word that I was open to offers, because I'm a great believer that if you actually want to change something, if you want something to happen, you can't stay still. You actually have to say, "Right, here I am, universe, do something." And if you're in a job and people see you in that job, they might not see you in another job. Whereas if you have stepped out of that job, it may be like, "Oh, I could use her for this. I could do something with this person." So when I said Baka Moscow, I suddenly attracted attention. So Condé Nast, back in London, they offered me a job as art director of Tatler. And IPC, who are the publishers of Marie Claire, they were launching a new website called bme.com. They wanted me to come on board there. But the thing I decided to say yes to was this. So this is a new magazine launched by my old company, BBC. And this was Eve. It was to be another women's monthly glossy magazine, but it was aimed at a slightly older audience. And I was creative director, and there were 4 of us in the art department, plus a website designer, and we had 2 picture editors, and I worked very closely with the fashion department and the beauty department, and that was one of the things that appealed to me about this job, because at Vogue I got a lot of experience at fashion and beauty, but there was a division between the departments, whereas here I got to cast models, choose photographers, go on shoots, and every couple of times a year I went to New York, and we did cover shoots in New York, and we did fashion shoots in New York, and this one up here, this was really fun. This was with a photographer called Mark Arbeit in New York, and I was in his office with Mark and his agent Danielle, and we were talking about what we could do for the shoot and talking about various things, and he said, she mentioned Fleet Week, which is when the American Navy comes to town. And I said, "Can we do something with the sailors?" So we got the sailors to pose with the models. It was very Sex and the City. And yeah, so Eve was great fun. And of course, all good things come to an end. And in this case, after 2 years, the editor left. Ironically, she left to go to Radio Times. And the new editor fired us. She fired me first, and then she fired everyone else. But that was fine, because she paid me off well, and that was fine. And I got 3 months off, which was very relaxing. And I took the opportunity to do something I've been thinking about for a while, which is to start my own magazine. So this is day 4. So the idea for this had come to me because as an art director, I was always seeing photographers' portfolios. That's a big part of my job. And it always seemed to me that the most interesting work that everybody did was not the work they were commissioned for, it was the work that they decided they wanted to do for themselves, and personal work. And so I came up with the idea of a publication that was all about personal work, the things that we do because we're excited about them or we're passionate about them, the things we do for love. And I came up with a name, Day 4, because I thought that, in an ideal world, you could work for a living 3 days a week. But on the 4th day, you work on whatever you're excited by or passionate about. You work for love. So Day 4 is all about the work we do for love. And of course, you get a 3-day weekend in any ideal world. And Day 4 has been one of the most rewarding things that I've ever done, even though it was so far ahead of its time that I really struggled getting people to understand it. But I published 1 issue every year. The format, as you can see there, it's slightly smaller than A4, and it's horizontal. And tons of photographers contributed. Nobody got paid, and I funded it myself. And I launched each issue with an exhibition and a party, and each edition had a theme. And yeah, it was really, really great. And I kept publishing it up until 2012. I couldn't do it after that. I was just doing too many other things. The day job took over. So the day job, back to that day job. So I've been out of Eve for 3 months, and I started something different again. So I was appointed art director of House and Garden. So no more shooting fashion. Instead, lots of houses and gardens, obviously. And the world of interior design is very different to the fashion world. And people are nicer. It's actually much more civilized. And we left the office on time. It was the only place I've ever left the office on time practically every day in my entire career. And I got to do the odd nice trip, especially to Ireland, funnily enough. Went home and we did shoot. I did houses in Dublin and houses down the Irish countryside. I did a stately home one time. And it was just very, very nice, very civilized, as I say. And I was at House and Garden for 4 years when my old boss, who'd hired me for Russian Vogue, called up. And I have to say a few words about my old boss now, because he's had a huge influence on my career over the years. His name is Bernd Runge, and he's East German. He knew Russia. He studied in the former USSR. He spoke Russian, and he was hired by Condé Nast to launch Vogue and to launch Condé Nast in Russia. It's not entirely clear. Does anyone know the name Bernd Runge? Okay, good. It's not entirely clear whether Condé Nast knew that while he was studying in the former USSR, he was recruited by the Stasi as an agent. This did come out eventually, many years later. But at the time, all that anyone knew was that he was very effective, very charming, very effective, very, very tough. And he and I got on great. So when Bernd called and asked me to meet the editor of this magazine, myself, which is based in Munich in Germany, I said, yeah, sure, absolutely. So myself, another women's magazine, another monthly. This was also aimed at a slightly older demographic. And my task with taking this on was to respect the demographic, but to try and make it a little more upmarket and aspirational, because the German market had tons of women's magazines, Brigitte, Fuzzy, tons and tons of them, and they're all very successful. So we had to stand out a bit and make it a bit more Condé. So we moved to Bavaria, to Munich, had a lovely little apartment with a nice balcony and a view of the Alps. And Steve loved it because they're two great local football teams, Bayern Munich and 1860, and the beer is fabulous. And so we had a really good time, and I stayed at myself for 2.5 years. And the reason I left was down to Bernd Runge again, because in 2009 he exited Condé Nast and he took a position as the CEO of an auction house, a contemporary art auction house named Philips de Pury, and he took me with him. So, Philips. The art world was new to me, but it was something that I'd always been drawn to, I always loved. And so this was very clearly going to be interesting work with very interesting people. And the company had never had a full-time art director. They'd always worked with external consultants. And there was an office in London and an office in New York. And the auctions were held, and still are, they're held in London and in New York, sometimes other places. But all the production, all the catalogs, the art catalogs, were made in New York. And this was very expensive, because you can imagine, you have to design it and print it and then ship it across to the UK or wherever. So my first task was to set up a production department, not an art department, a production department, because I wasn't just hiring designers, I was also hiring a sub-editor who would check all the text. And for auction catalogs, text is really important because you're telling all the details of every single work of art, how many centimeters wide, how many centimeters high it is, exactly who owned it first, all this stuff. They never heard of sub-editors before Philips. And I hired a production manager to organize working with printers in the UK. And art auction catalogs, again, it kind of, it's like, what's the big deal? But the thing is, people are selling pieces of art for huge amounts of money. And the clients want to see their work of art looking fabulous, photographed perfectly, printed beautifully on really, really, really rich paper. So there's a ton of money involved, and you have to get it right. And so these were the kind of things that were really important in that job and in that whole world. They still are. And from the design point of view, the most exciting thing for me was that you had your fine art sale and your design sale and your photography sale, but you also had theme sales. And the themes were things like Italy, music, film. And as part of those, we had an editor, Karen Wright, and Karen would commission writers to do articles, interviews, and so on. And I'd commission great photography. So we were photographing artists around the world, collectors around the world, and these catalogs are huge. They're really big. So it was really, really fun doing that. And I could do whatever I liked design-wise. And in many ways, it was a dream job because, of course, I was going back and forth to New York as well with my team there. But the bottom line with auction house is money. And after a while, the money kind of sucks all the fun out of it. So it was very stressful because of that. But I was rescued. Any guesses what country rescued me? Oh, I could put you out of the suspense. Russian Vogue again. So there was a new editor-in-chief. She was an old friend of mine. She'd been the beauty assistant when I started, and she was the editor-in-chief. And they wanted me to come back to Moscow to redesign the magazine for a new decade. So I went back to Moscow. This is late 2010. And boy, things had really, really changed at that stage. The city was transformed. There were designer boutiques. There were high street stores. There was cool restaurants and cafes and everything, and galleries. And people were very confident and very cool and very at ease with their place in the modern world, which sounds very patronizing, but it was true. It had really, really transformed. And many of my old friends were still there. My old desk was still there. But really, it was an amazing experience going back to a magazine that you launched 10 years on and getting the chance to sort of do a redo of it. And also because back into 1998, 2000, I'd done prototypes for GQ and AD, Architectural Digest, and they were all flourishing then as well. So we did all of this. I had tons of designers, did loads of great shoots, really interesting stuff, worked on an iPad edition, stayed in Moscow until 2012. I realized this would take more than 45 minutes, but we only have 10 years to go. And then I went back to London, and I continued working on books for Condé Nast Russia, but my next adventure was waiting, and this was different. This was GQ in India. So this was a consultancy. It was just a few months when GQ India were between art directors, and we were working on the Men of the Year issue, which was a huge annual issue. And we had these huge Bollywood style, you know, Bollywood, the big film industry. So we had Bollywood photographers and Bollywood sets to do the shoots. And I always say it's the only time I've ever been on a set where there were 36 people to shoot one man and a cat. And Condé Nast India is based in Mumbai, in Bombay. And I had a little apartment in Colaba, which was about 40 minutes walk from the office, or 15 very hair-raising minutes drive. And the living conditions were not great. It was monsoon, and the apartment was full of mice and cockroaches. And so there was that. And it was the smallest office I've ever worked in, with the most number of people squashed in. It was like the art department, which had me and Vivek here, and Giselle and Vasundra there, was literally the size of this. And we had a wall behind us with the pages of the magazine on it, which we had to pull a curtain over most of the time because other people could walk in and out of the office and see what was going on, and they were not supposed to. So it was very different, but it was fantastic. It was a great job. I think the hardest thing for me as a Westerner working in India, as opposed to being a tourist in India, is just the contrast between privileged lives and poor lives. Is just, it just does your head in, did my head in anyway. And the fact that people don't really seem to mind sometimes is very mind-boggling. But the job itself was really fun, and I loved the team, and I made good friends outside the office. And when I was about to leave, my next job was offered to me, and this was in Paris. So, slight digression. Over the years, Condé Nast had expanded around the world. So this shows where they have Vogues at the moment. The oldest edition is American Vogue, which Condé Nast bought and started publishing in 1909, and then British Vogue in 1916. And the reason British Vogue was launched was because World War I, the Atlantic was blockaded, so you couldn't actually ship your magazines from America to Europe. And the newest is Vogue Scandinavia and Vogue Singapore, which were both launched in 2020, and they're planning to start Vogue in the Philippines this year, apparently. So there's a lot going on. And in 2012, they decided to set up a brand development department in Paris, and the head of the department was someone I'd worked with in Russia, she was a features editor of Russian Vogue, and she'd risen through the ranks to become managing director of the Russian company. And she tapped me to join her in Paris and set up the new department. And we were a tiny team, but we did a lot of different things. We ran editorial conferences. I set up a corporate blog, and I worked on corporate branding, and we advised digital editorial teams around the world, which in my case meant providing a lot of design support. So for instance, the editor-in-chief of Vogue China, she was legendary, she wanted a redesign. So these are some of my redesign pages from Vogue China. And what she said was, "Oh, Fiona, can you do me 100 pages, please?" So I did. And Glamour in Brazil, they regularly got me to do covers and stuff, and I did a redesign for them. Glamour Bulgaria, it wasn't always very glamorous, but it was really fun. Glamour Bulgaria had like one person in the art department, and so I would help her out. I'd work directly with the photographer to work on layouts and stuff. And these are covers I used to do for Vogue Ukraine. This is the launch proposal for Vogue Poland. So I did all these kind of things. And sometimes I'd work from my desk in Paris, via email. And of course, this is pre-COVID, so a lot of times I would fly to the relevant office and I'd work right there with the team, which was really, really fun and really the best way of doing things. And apart from anything else, it's much faster, and if there's a language problem, it's much easier to get around the language problem if you're actually sitting there looking at a screen with somebody. And when you're sitting with a team, see, art departments are often overlooked by senior management, but the art department is the engine of a magazine particularly. And when you're chatting, you find out the really useful and important stuff that other people don't know. So for instance, I was in Beijing with the team from Vogue China, and that was how I found out that they'd never seen another edition of Vogue, because they got the international edition, but they went straight to the editor's office, and so nobody else was allowed to touch them. And because they have the great firewall, they can't Google anything. So most of them have not seen anything from the rest of the company ever. So I put together that night in my hotel room, I started putting together a presentation called The Family of Vogue, which I ran then and updated regularly for the whole time I was there. And the main reason why I knew so much about the new editions, because I launched them. I worked on the launches of all of these. Between 2013 and 2019, we launched 14 magazines. Vogue Thailand, Ukraine, Condé Nast Traveler and AD in Dubai, Vogue in Arabia, GQ Thailand, Glamour in Iceland, Traveler and Glamour in Turkey, GQ in the Middle East, Vogue in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hong Kong and Greece. So 7 Vogues in all. And my part of my job here was to be like an internal consultant art director, because they all had their own teams who were working in Athens and Hong Kong and Warsaw. And they were all good designers and they were all good fashion people. But my job was to make sure that they understood why it's a Vogue, what works for Vogue, what doesn't work for GQ, why Architectural Digest has to be like this and not like this. And when the local art department would put together their dummy pages, they would send them to me and I'd send them feedback on that. And I also did a load of corporate work on branding and logos across the company. And I worked on launches and brand unification for social media, worked on the launch of the Vogue business platform. I was the logo police. which was a full-time job in itself. Anyway, 6 years, a lot happened. And then in late 2018, I got a call from Bernd. We haven't heard from him for years. So Bernd said, are you ready for one more adventure? And his adventure turned out to be in the luxury retail sector. So he had joined the board of Mercury, which is a huge Russian retail conglomerate with a big department store in Moscow called Tsum and a big department store in St. Pete called DLT, and a host of designer boutique licenses. And he wanted me to come on board as consulting art director. And I had 17 designers on this one across Moscow and St. Petersburg, big teams. And everybody was working on different things. They were working on in-store, they were working on digital, they were working on advertising campaigns. I don't know, you know when you go to an airport and there's these really long, big light board advertising things, they're always really hideously ugly. We designed those things. And I designed nice versions and the marketing department changed them. So we did all this kind of stuff, and everyone was used to working in their own little section and their own little silos and fighting their own little battles. And what Bernd wanted me to do was restructure the design team, which was just restructure the design side of the business, which was a very good idea. But being an ex-Stasi, he wanted me to fire a bunch of people, which was not a terrible idea. Anyway, so I worked with the teams. I didn't fire anyone. And I worked with the teams to reorganize how they worked, and I hired a studio manager, and I did a ton of fashion shoots, and I art directed shoots for lookbooks. We worked on fashion shows. I recruited a social media manager. We did a load of work with her on relaunching Instagram accounts and so on. And then COVID happened. And I had a 2-year contract with Mercury. But obviously, as soon as lockdowns and quarantines started to happen, that was that. I couldn't go back to Moscow anymore. So end of that job. But luckily, I had some other things waiting in the wings. And the main one was a book launch. It was this book, the Fashion Yearbook. So this is an annual collection of some of the best fashion photography and illustration from magazines and advertising from around the world. And it's published, it was the inspiration of a German woman, Marcella Pryor-Kohlwe. She's a publisher. She makes really nice coffee table books. And she got my friend Julia Zirpel to come on board as author and editor. And Julia called me to be co-author and art director. And Julia and I know each other because she was the fashion director of myself when I was art director of myself in Munich. And we produced the first issue of the Fashion Yearbook in 2020 during lockdown. These are a few pages. And it was an amazingly creative time, 2020. You may not all know that, but trust me, it was an amazingly creative time for the fashion and publishing world, because things like Black Lives Matter and politics were having a huge impact on the fashion world and on magazines, and they were actually making people think politically and think outside their little fashion bubble. And of course, social distancing meant that people had to come up with new ways of working together, because if you're doing a fashion shoot and you can't have more than 3 or 4 people in a photo studio, or no people in a photo studio, how do you do a fashion shoot? So for the Fashion Yearbook, tons of amazing stuff. We have an international jury of experts who vote on the material that's submitted, that we bring in. People like one of the current jurors is Daniela Falcao, who's the former editor of Vogue Brazil. One of the current ones is Ania Rubik, the Polish supermodel and activist and photographer. And the second edition is out at the moment, but it's not on sale yet. I'd love to show you some pages, but it was supposed to be launched this month, but of course there's a war on, so the launch has been put back until probably May, June at this point. But it is available for pre-order. And I do like designing books. I've done a lot of books over the years, so this is something different. This is a much smaller publication. It's only 96 pages and it's paperback. And I want to put this in because I finally got my copies last week. It was published in December last year, and it's a tribute to a woman called Nokutela Ndima Dube, who's South African. She was born in South Africa in 1873, and she was a teacher, she was a writer, an educator, and a songwriter, and she was married to one of the founders of the founding president of the South African Native National Congress. And they launched a newspaper. They started a school. They went on speaking tours of the US. She was amazing. But her husband was unfaithful, and she left him, and she died alone at 44 years of age, and history forgot her. And my friend Asanda Cezanne, who's an amazing influencer, writer, former editor, all kinds of things in South Africa, she came across No Could Tell a Story and decided to bring it to a wide audience. So she's made a short film. She's commissioned artists to make work for it. And she put together all the stuff for the book, and she got me involved to design the book. And we did it really fast. We did it in December. Her team were in Cape Town and Joburg. I was in Shepherd's Bush. And we started off thinking we'd do like 40 pages, and then we just kept coming up with more amazing stuff. So I said, let's put another 8 pages in. Let's put another 8 pages in. And it was just over a month since, from when we started to when I sent it to the printers just before Christmas. And the book has been reprinted 4 times. South Africa's National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences has funded a schools outreach program based on the book. The film had a screening at Zeitsmoker, which is the most fantastic contemporary art museum in Cape Town. It was on sale at the Investec Cape Town Contemporary Art Fairs. It's just been amazing. And this little book, and it's very inspiring. This woman was amazing. And the last thing about working internationally here, it's obviously harder to work internationally when you're locked down in a pandemic, but I'm still doing it. And just more of it is via Zoom these days. So I'm design director at large for Vogue Hong Kong. We launched Vogue Men Hong Kong in April last year. I'm consulting for a big drinks company called Stolly Group, and I work across their brands with different creative agencies. So for their Latvian vodka, I found them a Paris-based production company for a campaign we're working on, and I've been working to brief the Paris production company. On Wednesday, day before yesterday, I was on WhatsApp with Lee, who's one of the art directors of another agency, a marketing agency we work with, and he was in Monaco doing a photo shoot. So Lee and I are exchanging messages back and forth on WhatsApp. He's sending me the pictures so I can be involved in the shoot in Monaco from Shepherd's Bush. And also this week I had a call with the head of the tequila division. Charlie's in Boston, Massachusetts. The tequila is made in Mexico, and there's a problem with their presentation, but I found a friend who's an art director in Brighton who's going to redo the presentation for Charlie to present again and make it a lot better. And I do wacky things like source an airplane paint scheme designer. So that meant a lot of Zoom calls with airplane paint scheme designers for a private jet. And they're all based in places like New Jersey and Alabama. And I lecture. I do lots of lecturing. And I think this is probably a good point to stop lecturing and drink some water and see questions. And so basically you can follow me on Instagram. I'm the Art Dictator. The Fashion Yearbook Instagram is over there as well. And that's the sneak preview of the cover of the current Fashion Yearbook, which is, as I say, not out there, but it's available for pre-order. So, an hour. Does anyone have any questions? Great question.
Thank you so much.
And by the way, I'm going to have to come over. You're going to have to talk to me close up.
Thank you. It was very inspiring.
Good.
I was wondering, what was the most stimulating and the most challenging stages? What were the most stimulating and challenging stages of your artistic journey? So you work in so many places doing such amazing stuff.
The most stimulating and the most challenging situations in my career journey, kind of
so
thing.
Like stages of your
Stages. Very good question. Okay, let me think. It's hard to pick out one of each. Launches are always really exciting. Launching anything is really fun. It's really tiring and really stressful, of course, but everything is full of promise. So launching in Vogue in Russia was something else. Launching Eve was great. I was hoping that I could show you today my latest launch, which was due to go live yesterday, but we seem to have had some technical glitches. I've just been overseeing the new website for Stoli Group, and it's really great, but it's not live yet. I think every time there's a new product or a new project, that's the most stimulating thing, because everything is possible. And whether it is a website or a book like Nocatella or the Fashion Yearbook or a new magazine, it's always just like just because the promise is there, nobody's got bored or too tired or anything yet. And the most challenging, well, personally, of course, there's always a time that you're just kind of going, I'm so far from home, I'm so tired, I miss Steve, I want to go home, I've had enough. And you get tired of that kind of, but in terms of career and the world that I work in particularly, the most challenging has probably been the most recent times when everyone's retrenching. So publishing is really changing. People are not spending money the way they used to. The internet has really affected advertising, for print advertising and so on. And so Condé Nast, for example, they laid off tons of staff around the world in the last year. And of course, I don't know if you noticed, but Condé Nast pulled out of Russia 2 weeks ago, I think. And for someone, I showed you, I've designed, I love Vogue Ukraine, I've worked on Vogue Ukraine, but I worked on Russian Vogue 24 years ago, and 24 years of work and passion and commitment and care and people really loving their jobs, and suddenly it's gone like that. That's really hard. I mean, obviously it's hard for me to see, but for them. So I'd say the most challenging thing is actually adjusting to economic realities. It's a bit depressing, but that's true. Hang on, let me come over.
First of all, thank you so much for this very aesthetic and stimulating presentation. It was really pleasurable to sort of observe it. But I was just sort of reflecting on the kind of interesting thought that you mentioned regarding the social movements and how, for example, Black Lives Matter movement sort of evoked in the fashion world and industry that was quite visible, the influence of it. I was just sort of wondering, because you mentioned that throughout your career you've been working in a variety of industry, in a variety of cultural contexts, and I was just sort of reflecting, how did you sort of adjust, or whether you had adjust in terms of tailoring the sort of the way that you were sort of approaching those different contexts and different environments in terms of working, and sort of how does that influence on the fashion manifestation that you were sort of overshadowing and leading to? Yeah.
Very good question. So how has cultural change and
just a variety of cultural contexts.
Dealing with a variety of cultures and also cultural change, of course, happening all the time and everything. It's, in a way, there are a couple of answers to this. One of the things is that, as I said at the beginning, interesting work in interesting places with interesting people is what I do, is what I like. So I'm always excited by I have a very low boredom threshold, and I get very bored very quickly, and I like to try new stuff. So I really relish going to new places and meeting new people and trying new things. Not in everything in the world, but I love my job. I love designing, so I love meeting designers. So there's that. So part of it is you have to be open to it. Then a lot of it, to be perfectly honest, is realizing how much of the time you're wrong about stuff, and how much our society and other societies are changing so fast. And the things that we thought were acceptable 5 years ago are not acceptable. Like, leaving aside racial issues and political issues. You know GQ magazine. You've more or less seen GQ magazine. So one of the things we used to do was we used to organize conferences, as I said, and every year I had to do a talk to all the editors at the conference about about whatever it was going to be about. And for GQ in, I think it was 2018 or 2019, the Me Too movement had just started. You know, people had started saying, women had started to stand up and say what had happened to them and accusing men of what they'd done. And there were people like Louis C.K., the comedian, who was accused of sexual assault or something. There was Kevin Spacey, who was accused of sexually assaulting a young man. And the talk that I did that year, I didn't plan it, but it turned out, I went through all the GQs that we had, which were about 16 at that point, you know, French, Italian, American, blah, blah. And I looked at who they put on the covers. And month after month, year after year, they put these people on the covers who are now coming out as having been abusers of all kinds. James Franco, Kevin Spacey, of course, Louis C.K. I can't remember now, but everyone, time after time, month after month, it was just happening the whole time. These men were being put on the covers. And the other thing with GQ was they were putting scantily clad women on the covers. And we looked at this for years and years and years, and it was only literally in like 2019 when suddenly people started going, we can't do that. So a large part of it is just kind of suddenly, you have to suddenly stop and go, what the fuck have I been doing all this time? You can't, your consciousness doesn't raise itself naturally. Every now and then you get slapped upside the head. And you really have to take that and kind of go, right, I was really wrong. We have to change.
And do you think that change has a therapeutic
Sorry?
value? Do you think that change, in terms of what you show to your audience, has a therapeutic value?
For me or for?
For the audience, I would say.
Well, it's kind of to an extent, maybe. I'm not sure how, to an extent, but I'm not sure how much. I mean, it makes a difference in that. So one of the people who was on one of the covers for one of the GQs, she appeared on a few covers, was, and I've forgotten her name, that wonderful South American actress. All right, completely forgotten. But anyway, she was on the cover of a couple of GQs, and she was wearing this kind of like, you know, negligee kind of thing. And she did a big article in the New York Times saying Harvey Weinstein was my abuser too. And it was very important that magazines and publishers and so on acknowledge that they've made a mistake. But it's therapeutic, but I'm not sure how therapeutic it was for the victims. Do you know what I mean? That make any sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Hang on, let me come over.
You started your career in the 80s, like you said, and so print was big and there wasn't the internet. So my question just now is, do you think print is dying?
No, print is not dying. That's an excellent question. I'm glad you asked it. Print is not dying, but the interesting thing about print is that commercial magazines, they are probably dying, and they're certainly dying in the form that we have got used to them. But independent magazines, there are more of them than ever. So Day 4, when I was publishing Day 4, it was really hard because nobody had done anything like that. And I was going, well, you do it once a year. That doesn't make any sense. That's not a magazine. Now there are thousands of magazines that come out once a year. And they're on different topics. You know, they're everything from like shoes to food to cake to like music to absolutely everything. So print is not dying at all. But this mass market kind of one size fits all, that's definitely on its last legs. And I think one of the things that's unfortunately going to contribute to that, I don't have a slide of it here, but remember the Cosmos with the 3 covers? That's happening more, content sharing. So for instance, in September, all the GQs around the world use the same shoot. So all the covers are the same. So that's kind of fine if you want to read about the weekend in Thai and German and Italian. But if you want to read something about a Thai star or a German designer or an Italian writer, you're not going to get that anymore. So that's the answer to that one. Independent publishing, huge. Mass market commercial, dead, dying, will be dead. I'm glad I'm not doing it. Hang on.
Thank you for being an interesting person and showing us interesting things.
Sorry?
My question
Yes?
is, how did you find jumping around so many fields? Because we're going from fashion to art to gardening, you know, all these things. And I'm wondering if you found it exhausting or exciting. And also, whether you find that all creative fields require more or less the same skills
Yeah.
to apply in different fields.
Okay, very good question. So different themes, different areas of working in different areas, and do they use the same skills?
Yeah.
So basically, I don't like work. I wouldn't say I would work in anything and everything. Like for instance, I don't cook, so I probably wouldn't work on a cooking magazine or do a cookbook or that kind of thing. But I don't have a garden, so I probably wouldn't do that. So there is a limit. I have my parameters, I have my limits. But I find that between art, fashion, photography, film to an extent, those things, those are all things that I'm interested in. So it's not a problem switching from one to the other. And you get, again, as I was saying, you get bored. I get bored. So I like to be able to switch around from place to place. And in terms of the skills that you use, if you're an art director like me, it's all about A, design, and B, running teams. And so a team is, there are basic ways that you run teams, whether it's, you know, or work with teams, whether it's one person in Sofia, Bulgaria, or 17 people in Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's the same skills when you're working with teams translate absolutely everywhere, I think. So yeah, I like the subject matter doesn't matter to me on the whole, but the skills are pretty much, yes, they pretty much are the same. And another skill is I find being able to analyze what you're looking at. I do that with absolute, I think that's what people hire me for these days more than anything else. Being able to look at something, like Charlie's presentation, the tequila guy, and say, you know what's wrong with this? I know what's wrong with this. This is, and this is, and this is, but you're saying this, and I have just the guy to fix it for you. So that kind of thing. Hang on, I'll ask a new person. Actually, let me come around there. Sorry for all the running around, guys. I just can't hear from this far away.
That's cool. My question is, what's the decision process for what lands on a cover, and what are the heated conversations about?
Sorry, say that again?
Decision process for what lands on the front cover of Vogue or whatever. What are the heated conversations about, and can you give us an example from your career?
Okay, so what is the decision process for covers?
Yeah.
For any particular magazine, or just generally?
Let's say Vogue.
Very complicated, very good question, and very unsimple. There are different ways this happens. The way it's planned to happen, wherever you are, whatever magazine you are, if you're a monthly magazine particularly, if you're fashion, I'll come back to fashion, is normally you plan in advance and you think, right, I want to do a shoot with this celebrity or this model or this, that, and the other, and you plan things in advance. And if you're well organized, you might plan things, say, a year in advance. And then life happens, and your plans usually get tossed around. And so, for instance, in April 2020, when COVID was really starting to hit, a lot of magazines had made a decision. They were working. So Vogue Italia, for instance, they'd been working on their April issue, and it was a cover picture with a model called Freya Beha Eriksson, and she was wearing a white shirt and I think a green hat or something. And there's an Italian magazine, GQ, called, was it GQ? Or L'Uomo Vogue. So they had two men, and L'Uomo Vogue and Vogue were both going to do the same covers, but Freya was on the women's cover, and a male model, I can't remember who it was on the male cover, and they're dressed the same. And so there's this big concept about sharing your clothes or gender swap or whatever it was. And they had everything ready to go, and then people started dying. And in April, Vogue, Italy had the worst death count outside of China. You know, people, it was really, they had the worst case of COVID. So they realized you can't put out a magazine with this sexy fashion message at a time like this. So they scrapped it. They just said, right, we'll do this another time. And they just did white covers. And that's a whole other story for another time. But it was completely thrown. And the same happened to a lot of magazines, that you make a decision and then something happens. But in a more practical level, what can happen is you do a shoot and the pictures don't work out, or you do a shoot and something more interesting comes along. So the decision process about who you're originally going to have or what you're originally going to have is always like, well, our readers like Rihanna, or our readers like, whatever it is. But then whether Rihanna gets on the newsstands or whether she's kicked off by COVID, that you can't really plan for. Does that answer your question? Not really.
Partly. I was gonna say,
who
makes the final call?
Who gets
the final call? Let's say you got a team of people designing the cover, say, yeah, it works brilliant.
Editor-in-chief.
And then he says it's wrong. And
Editors-in-chief get the final call unless I'm there. That's not true. Most of the time, editors-in-chief get the final call. But I tell you a story. When Vogue Hong Kong was launching, they wanted Kaya Gerber for the cover, and Kaya Gerber is Cindy Crawford's daughter. She at the time, Kaya Gerber was the hottest model in the world. This was January 2019, March 2019. But anyway, and Kaya had appeared on the cover of Vogue Italia and Vogue Japan, I think. However, Condé Nast made a decision that they would not allow models under 18 to appear on covers. And she was under 18. So they'd gone all the way down trying to get her on the cover. And Condé Nast and the editor and the publisher, for their launch issue, you know, this is all they wanted. But the company said, nah, you can't. So that kind of thing happens. Most of the time, it is the editor making the choice, but a lot of the time, well, not a lot, but occasionally, you know, fate intervenes. Something happens like that. There are many times, like when we were launching Vogue Czechoslovakia, the team in Prague had a very clear idea what they wanted on the cover, and the team in London had hated everything that was supposed to go on the cover. And I was in Prague trying to have a broker meeting between the team in Prague and my boss and the head of new markets in London. And I was saying to the guys in Prague, I was thinking, you know, they don't like this. And I was saying to the team, you know, they love this. And it was a huge fight. It was an absolutely huge row. And there was a kind of compromise in the end, because Vogue Czechoslovakia came out with a range of different covers, but the cover that they really, really wanted, they weren't allowed to run.
Thank you.
How are we doing for time, by the way? We're not really talking about personal branding. Is there any questions about personal branding? But please, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, because at the very beginning you said that you're not a public speaker.
Yeah.
Is that something you just don't enjoy doing, or is that something you had to overcome over time? Obviously, your career demands public speaking a lot. So how did you cope with that?
Well, thank you for asking. Now I can't say anything. I'm not an official public speaker, but I have to talk. It's part of my job. So and now I'm used to it, especially because I do a lot of lecturing. I run a module on professional practice at Oxford Brookes on the photography course. I run a module at Condé Nast College of Fashion and Design, so I still have a Condé Nast connection. I'm an industry speaker at Ravensbourne University. I'm about to be a MA supervisor at Nottingham Trent. So basically, you just got to do it. And I'm kind of used to it now. It's very hard to get me to shut up at this point. Does anyone want to ask me anything about personal branding? Because I'm like, I honestly thinking about this, as I say, I am now not able to speak. I didn't actually set out to have a personal brand. I don't think I have a personal brand. I think I'm just an art director who uses Instagram, for example. But I don't really have it. I think on the whole, there are people who have personal brands, but
I don't know if it's about personal branding, but how would you recommend for an emerging artist to break into an industry like this?
which industry?
Art industry. Well, it's
Is it
very
magazines or publishing or
publishing magazines, because it's very different doing a practical art course
Yeah,
and then actually having real life skills and doing real life things.
yeah.
You're not just going to be sitting in a studio or painting all the time. And I'm trying to think of different career routes that require similar skills but are more feasible in terms of it's like creating your brand as an artist, I guess. Yeah.
Creating a brand as an artist.
Yeah.
Well, are you doing NFTs?
Well, you know, that's,
Well, stop it doing
we
NFTs.
should have this point, but no.
I think, what would be a good answer to that? So, well, the personal branding thing, that I did actually look up personal branding on definition in Wikipedia, and it does say, it says something about curating your, hang on, I wrote it down here. And it might be relevant. Okay, here we go. Personal branding is the conscious and intentional effort to create and influence public perception of an individual by positioning them as an authority in their industry, elevating their credibility, and differentiating themselves from the competition to ultimately advance their career, increase their circle of influence, have a larger impact. And the process of personal branding involves finding your uniqueness, building a reputation on the things you want to be known for, and then allowing yourself to be known for them. Ultimately, the goal is to create something that conveys a message and that can be monetized. So basically, I guess if you kind of like build your personal brand by finding your uniqueness, building a reputation on the things you want to be known for, and allowing yourself to be known for them, and then you can monetize that. That's my best shot. That's my career goal.
So you've kind of cemented your status as like art director, legend, all that. Do you think you'd ever go into writing? Like, do you think you've just settled in art and that you don't want to go, like you wouldn't write like a memoir or like an expose or something like that? And will you go back to New York, do you think?
No, I don't think I'll go back. No, I think the moment's passed with New York. This is the thing. To be honest, more at this point is like, would I go back to Paris? Because I lived in Paris on and off for 6 years, and Paris is the best place in the entire world. But the answer to that question is I don't have time at the moment, and thank God for that. It's really nice to be really busy. I'm slightly in that perennial freelance thing, you take on too much. So we're doing this today. Tomorrow I'm moderating the art panel. And then Monday, I've got a 3-hour session on campaigns versus branding with a bunch of new students at Condé Nast College. And I've got a 2-hour session in the afternoon about something else. It's about campaigns, coming up with products. And my idea for the students for that is I'm going to reverse engineer stuff. And so, because it's very easy, if you have you think, oh, I have an idea, it's a great idea, I'll propose this, it'll be really successful, it'll be a brand extension, it'll be really successful. But the other side of this is that if you're a brand and someone says, I have this great idea, here you go. How do you figure out if it's a great idea? So what I'm going to get them to do is things like, I'm going to say, right, imagine you are a multinational cultural institution and you have this great idea, which is that you're going to monetize the top tier of your audience and you're going to make this much money. Good idea, bad idea. This is a real scenario. Anyone got any ideas? Good idea, bad idea. Does it sound good? Does it sound bad? What if I told you it was the Super League? Good idea, bad idea. So this is the kind of, so I've got a lot of stuff going on. And so I don't have time for, although when I was preparing this, my sister said, are you writing your autobiography here? And I said, no. Yeah, so I'll just keep doing until I run out of track. Is that it?
I have a question.
Oh, you have a question?
I think we're just about to finish timing-wise, but I have a question. So reflecting back on the amazing history of your career and all the jobs you had, what would you suggest your younger self, so like, you know, people like us who are 20 and above, what would you suggest your younger self, which maybe you missed out on, like maybe some things which you regret not pursuing?
It's a very good question, and I'm very pleased to say there's very little that I regret. I really have been quite lucky because this interesting work, interesting places, and interesting people really has served me tremendously well. It has meant that I've never stayed too long in a job that I've been bored with. I've never said no to something and then wished I'd said yes to it. I mean, Stephen, we don't have kids. I've moved around an awful lot. So, you know, you make your life compromises and so on. But on the other hand, I'm very happy with my life compromises. So what I would suggest to you guys, what I say to me is probably learn to drive. But what I say to you guys is reach out, connect with people. That's the thing I'm really saying to people nowadays, students particularly, is because especially we've all gone through, you know, COVID and everything, locked in our rooms. And I keep referring to my room in Shepherd's Bush. I literally am in this little small room an awful lot of the time. But we have the internet. The one thing I think that we're incredibly lucky about now, when I was a teenager growing up in the Irish countryside, I fucking hated it. It was, sorry for swearing, but it was just the most isolated time. My parents had this house in the flipping hill in the middle of nowhere. I hated it. And I really wanted to be in the city with people because we didn't have the internet. Now, I know that social media has tons of pressure. I know that the pressures are different, but it's a really useful tool, connection. And I do think the most important thing that you can do at the moment is reach out, talk to each other, talk to other people, send messages to people. If there's somebody that you're interested on Instagram or Twitter or anywhere that you kind of would like to have a chat with, feel free, just DM them and say, I really like what you're doing or whatever. And you'll find most of the time, a lot of people are busy, but most people actually like to be connected with. And that would be my advice now to everyone is, we don't know what's going to happen for the rest of this year, let alone the next 2 to 5 years or whatever. I don't know what areas you all want to build your careers in. I don't know how it will change, but I do think connect, talk. Don't close yourselves down, open yourselves out. That's my advice. Thank you so much. Thank you. That was nice.
I think we're good for timing. Thank you, Fiona, for doing this talk. It was extremely amazing, and so many people are here. So thank you guys for all coming. It's great having you here. So.
Thank you, everyone. It was really fun, and thank you for staying awake. I'm impressed.